Hey guys, this is Tom with The Student Teacher and Not an Article, and today I get the pleasure of interviewing my friend Jo here, and we're going to talk a bit about ACEs, trauma, and the development and how that affects us in education. And so without further ado, I'm going to ask you, Jo, can you just tell me a bit about yourself, your background, your experience and whatnot?
Yeah, okay. So I've been in teaching and education for around about 25 or slightly more years. I've been a primary school teacher largely, and I've taught across the primary age range. I've been a deputy and a head teacher, and now I work in an organisation called the Virtual School. Every local authority has one, and I'm based in the eastern region of the UK.
Okay, awesome. And so you do a bit of work and have looked into doing research into ACEs, trauma, and how that affects us. Could you, for me, just explain kind of ACEs and trauma, generally what are they, and kind of how they affect us developmentally?
So all of my work is with children who are looked after by the local authority, and within my team, we all work with children and schools to ensure that they make good progress in school. And so therefore we work with the most vulnerable children in society and those who've experienced the most number of ACEs. Yep. So when we talk about ACEs, we're talking about adverse childhood experiences. Statistics show us that if a child has 4 or more, then their health, their education and their life chances and their outcomes are adversely affected. Okay. So my understanding of that is that there are many, many children and young people in the UK with ACEs. Some of them experience more ACEs. Those ACEs then become dangerous and they're taken into the care of the local authority and go into foster care. Yeah. However, there's a huge percentage of children, a large kind of underneath the surface, like an iceberg of children who are experiencing possibly 2 or 3 that might be negatively impacting on them, and they're kind of skimming below the threshold of social care. Yeah. Many, many of those. My understanding is that then this goes on to affect learning. If schools are a protective factor, yeah. Undoubtedly, not only because they offer children a pathway out of ACEs, if you like, if education is good and pastoral work is good, but also it means that there are pairs of eyes on those children. Yeah. And that things that are happening at home can then be picked up on and possibly helped, possibly nipped in the bud for that child.
Okay, and so could you just give me like an example of what an ACE could be?
Right, so an ACE, ACEs are described quite clearly actually if you have a look through articles and information about them. So they range from something as fairly benign as marriage breakdown and separation of parents to parental alcoholism, parental drug use, homelessness, poverty, yep. Domestic abuse. That's what we're talking about, yep. Adverse childhood experiences. So you could have a child who is living with 1 or 2 parents who have addiction issues, mental health issues. Therefore, they don't work so well, they perhaps don't go to work, they're perhaps on benefits, they get into rent arrears, they are ejected out of where they live, they have to move. That child is experiencing all of that alarming adult behaviour and equally experiencing that poverty as well.
Yeah, wow. And so developmentally, from the research and I'm doing teacher training and we've done safeguarding and childhood, yeah. Cognitive development. Yeah. And these ACEs actually really affect how the brain yeah. forms its patterns and how you link in socially, isn't it? So in development, what do ACEs actually do in terms of affecting behaviour? Right.
So from as early as within the womb, a baby is affected by ACEs, by what the mother does and the experience that's happening to the mother. So we know from research that when a child is in the womb, if the mother is taking drugs, if the mother is using alcohol, if the mother is experiencing domestic abuse, then the chemical reactions in her body are affecting the child. Yeah. The child can hear the outside world, they can perceive stress, they receive the cortisol that's being surging through the mother's body. But not only that, for example, if the mum is smoking weed, for example, then the lack of oxygen is causing lack of oxygen to the child's brain. Wow. the alarming events that happen to mum that causes adrenaline and cortisol being raised will then affect the baby's brain. So the child is born already with raised levels of cortisol and adrenaline in them. And then once the child is born, if those things continue, then they are developmentally on high alert all the time, which if you're in a situation which you need to freeze or flight or fright, flight, freeze mode.
Flight or fright response.
Yeah. Freeze is another one though. And that's okay if you have to be protecting yourself against something. It's not okay if those things are triggered over and over and over because of shouting or noise or door slamming or being left for prolonged periods of time crying. Yeah, wow. The main thing to remember is very small infants and small children need to have secure attachment with a primary caregiver.
Yes. And
that primary caregiver soothes the child and brings the calm to their life. The child cannot self-soothe. A child who's distressed will cry and cry and cry and cry and cry, and the cortisol and the adrenaline are raising in the child's body. And these cause things to happen in the brain which switch off the thinking in the frontal lobe and switch on the limbic system. And so the child is always on that fear mode.
Yeah.
Parent comes along and should rock and soothe. If that's not happening over and over and over and over and over, a child becomes very self-reliant, or they become very withdrawn, or they become very angry, they become like tigers, or they become like chameleons and change for their environment, or they curl up and become like a possum and freeze. And so the research around that brain development is really crucial. So in effect, what's happening for an infant and a young child is brain damage.
Wow. Like to that extent?
It's to that extent.
Wow.
Yeah. If it's very severe, eventually the child can present with similar characteristics to autism and similar characteristics to ADHD.
Wow.
So we then wonder why lots of children in school have ADHD.
Yeah, but it's really could like be prevented, ADHD.
Could be. ADHD can be treated with medication and is a definite thing.
Yeah.
But we have lots of children and young people that present in school who have really difficult time in concentrating. And that's because their brain is so used to being hypervigilant that they're always on the lookout for other things.
Yeah.
They're not used to being calm, they're not used to being soothed, and therefore they can't self-soothe.
Yeah.
So that parent coming in and soothing teaches the child how to self-soothe. So around about the age of 2 or 3, they should then be able to self-soothe, knowing and bearing in mind that, someone will always come because they always come. And I know that there's someone in the background who loves me and is keeping me in mind because she always shows up when I cry.
Yeah.
If she doesn't show up when I cry, I don't know how to self-soothe, and therefore my mind is all over the place.
Yeah, wow. It's really interesting just thinking how that would affect behaviour. And so my next question kind of goes on in terms of education.
Yeah.
And so behaviour policy is obviously a hot topic, how we handle behaviour.
Yeah.
And in your opinion, which approach kind of works best when it comes to trauma and being sensitive to trauma while also dealing with the behaviours?
Yeah. I think what we need to bear in mind is that schools' behaviour policies need to reflect how cognizant they are of trauma and attachment issues coming out of ACEs. All staff in schools need to know that they have children in school who are vulnerable, who have perhaps for most of their childhood had difficulties, they've had poverty, or they've witnessed domestic violence. Not so bad that they've been taken away from their family, but bad enough to cause them to find the world a frightening place and to not trust people and to always be on guard and to always be the ones that are lashing out or the ones who are causing the conflict because that's the way they get attention or that's the way they fight with the world. If staff are aware of that and which children that affects, then they know that their responses need to be tempered. And within the school policy needs to be trauma sensitive or trauma aware. So schools that say we have a zero tolerance policy, are they trauma sensitive? Actually, that child has just knocked that table and chair over because last night his dad gave his mum a black eye and he's worrying about it. And he thinks that the way that you respond to difficulties is with violence. Now, if our response is we know that child's going to do that, and we know that our response is to remain calm and to say, would you like some time out? Rather than, right, that's it, out.
Yeah.
Our responses make all the difference. It's not about being positive or negative, it's about being aware that stuff happens to children. Not what's wrong with them, what's happened to them.
Yeah, definitely kind of using that emotional intelligence to see that there could be something beyond the behaviour. Yeah. It's
emotional intelligence combined with knowledge.
Yeah.
Combined with knowledge that child in my class, when they've come in for maths, I know that they have a really difficult home life. Therefore, I know that if I raise my voice, that will heighten their adrenaline, that will heighten their response, and that many children respond very badly to raised voices.
Yeah.
They respond very badly to things happening suddenly or unexpectedly. Lots of children don't like people standing behind them or brushing up against them.
Interesting.
Because that immediately sparks a physical sensory memory of stuff that's happened to them.
Wow.
We hold a lot of trauma and anxiety in our bodies. And children who have experienced trauma throughout their lives experience touch in a very much more heightened sensitive way than many other children do.
Yeah.
So you have a situation where Bobby's walking down the corridor and Billy walks past and accidentally brushes into them, and then immediately there's a boof and there's a fight.
Yeah.
There's like a spark happens. Because throughout his whole life, someone has given him a bit of a clomp or a nudged up against him, and he's had to be very careful that person's not going to hit him around the head. Yeah. Or be violent or be abusive to him in some way. And therefore, many of our young people are always on their mettle, if you like. They're always hypervigilant to things. If schools have policies that say, we don't shout, we don't exclude, we have restorative justice, as it were.
Yeah.
We come back to the situation when they're calm and we talk it through. And we find ways of calming. And we give children strategies and places to go and people to go to when they're starting to feel that happening. In primary school, we have things like anxiety mapping. So we have someone who will observe a child and they'll say, when they come in, they're right up here.
Yeah.
So we will map that. 9 o'clock in the morning, a little cross goes and they're right up here, kind of, or whatever vocabulary you want to use. We know that then it comes to sitting on the carpet time and they've calmed a bit, so then they've come down a bit.
Yeah.
In assembly time, they're great, so they're right down there, and then woof, there it is up again. So what are we looking at? We might be looking at the fact that transitions are difficult for this child. Coming into school, going out to the playground, coming back into the classroom, transitions are hard.
Yeah.
Why is that? Is it because they're crowded? Is it because it's noisy? Is it because they don't know where they're going? Is it because any sort of change is difficult for that child? Wonder why that is. Is it because they've lived in 5 different houses?
Yeah.
Have they been evicted? It's about understanding and unknotting those knots for that child.
Yeah.
And if we understand that transitions are difficult for Bobby, we then say, Bobby, you can go first, because then you're not squashed in the crush of people.
Yeah.
Or we have a whole school culture that we're quite quiet in this school. We try and keep it's very difficult, very difficult, but we try and keep the calm.
Yeah.
Rather than it all becomes quite noisy.
Yeah.
You're bound to have noisy times, aren't you?
Definitely.
You know, lunchtime, cafeteria, those sorts of places. But then you say, well, I know that child finds that really hard. We may have incidences in the cafeteria, we might have incidences outside. How are we going to set life up for them in school so that they're not set up for those things to happen already for them and heighten their anxiety?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Think about how, I guess, the intentional systems we can put in place as schools that are trauma sensitive while also mitigating behaviour before it kind of happens.
Yeah. Every young person needs to know that there are boundaries. You can't hurt people. You can't swear at staff.
Yeah.
We don't have that. But how we convey that is key. You know, if someone stands up and they let out a stream of swearing and they kick some stuff over, if they know there's a place they can go where they go and sit with Mrs. Thing and they have a cup of tea and she says, come on, what's up?
Yeah.
It's not about, right, that's it, you're out.
Yeah, it's a safe space.
Safe space.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on from that, what do you think is the responsibility of schools in the fight against ACEs? Because obviously schools, as we know, are very focused on the academics, the results, and education is their priority, but they also have a secondary responsibility of raising up people, young people, and giving them that safe environment. But where does it kind of get where it's more of a public health issue, and where is it the school's responsibility?
Yeah.
What's the line to walk?
Yeah, it's really hard. I guess with younger children, it's about, as you've said before, creating a safe space, creating a culture in which they feel safe, that they can trust people, there's always someone to go to. If home is really rocky, school is their safe place, and that's the case for many, many children. School's protective. I think going forward, if PSHE or whatever they call it in schools, in whichever school, can teach more about addiction, more about health, more about making good choices, more about not being drawn into friendships or cultures that are bad for you, if you like.
Yeah.
So many of our vulnerable children get drawn into smoking weed, doing county lines. That's quite extreme, the county line side, and they tend to be our very vulnerable children, and they're preyed on because there's no one looking out for them. Schools, some schools I know have networks where they map their children's propensity to get into things like county lines and gangs.
Yeah.
And they keep an eye on them and they watch their behaviour really closely, so that if they see changes in behaviour, they kind of go on alert. They have good relationships with the local PCSO or the local force, so that outside of school time, those PCSOs or the local police force know that those kids meet in that park, and they know there's a gang around the corner.
Yeah.
So it's about communication with the outside world, I guess, as well. So school then extends to the community. Schools are a community, and they're in the community. So again, it's like educating the child and having the attitude that look, I'm not just telling you stuff, but this is real life.
Yeah.
I guess clever teaching, where you're possibly showing videos or showing possibly case studies of things that can happen to children.
Yeah.
They grow up, they become like this, or they become like that. It can help. Giving them aspirations.
Yeah.
Trying to make sure they don't become neat, not in education or a training.
Yeah.
Trying to ensure that they have options. So schools might think, you know what, they're really not going to do well in GCSEs. Let's get them to do other things. Let's put them on a BTEC. Let's funnel them into colleges so that they're kept busy till they're 18. They don't have the chance just to get out on the streets and do nothing.
Yeah.
The harder ones to crack are those in which they have more aces in their life, and perhaps there's domestic violence and there's poverty and there's addiction problems.
Yeah.
And by the time they get to about probably 14, 15, a lot of those patterns are really hard set, and their brain is already, if you like, damaged by a lot of the things that have happened to them. In which case, I would hope that schools would have even more of a firm grip on those kids.
Yeah.
And be really aware. The best schools that I know of really know their children.
Okay.
They really know their young people. They know their environments and backgrounds. They know from primary school that their parents have never really turned up to parent-teacher consultations.
Yeah.
They know from notes that come from primary school that there have been rumbling issues, that they have had possibly social worker involvement, or that they've had some kind of initiative involvement, like Thriving Families or the government's Troubled Families kind of scheme. And one would hope then that the pastoral and the mentoring would kick in as a protective factor to these things going forward. The difficult thing is that there are so many outside influences on young people that as soon as they hit about 14, 15...
It's really hard to control
It's
them,
really
I guess.
difficult,
and
yeah.
especially with social media and the amount they can access just
Definitely.
on the internet, it's really difficult to keep track of it all.
The real key is being relational.
Yes.
That in everything, if you have good relationships, if you have a relational approach, approach is the absolute nub of dealing with trauma with children.
Wow.
Because their relationships with their primary caregivers have broken down.
Yeah.
Or if not broken down, they're very dysfunctional. So if you have dysfunctional primary relationships, if you can then have functional ones in school where they feel they can trust somebody and that person cares about them genuinely, it goes miles.
Yeah, I guess that's a culture you have to cultivate as a school.
You do.
That relational, and that we'll go the extra mile for our kids.
Hence, if you have a trauma-informed culture in the school, you don't then have people who say things like, oh, he's just really naughty. Or it's not fair, how come he goes in the calm room, and all of that lot who are really good don't. Well, hang on a minute. We're talking about levelling things up here. that child in the calm room hasn't started on a level playing field like all those other children who have interested parents. They've started right down there. And actually we need to be trying to level up the playing field for them with education, with care, with interest, and replacing the things that they haven't had.
Yeah, definitely. I love all of that. So moving on from that, and we kind of touched on it a bit on preventative measures. And in my training, we looked at safeguarding and just how we respond in event of, like, if someone admits something that's happened and how we deal with it. And I found it all to be a bit, like, reactive. And obviously I'm new, so I don't know what extent to you. But I was like, okay, so we wait for something to happen. So not wait for something to happen, but something will happen, and then we find out and report it, and then things are put in place. How do you feel, do the schools have more of a preventative approach, or is it a reactive approach?
Safeguarding is by its nature reacting to something. Yeah. So a safeguarding policy will be all about what we do when we see this or this, or when a young person tells us something. But it will also have around it things like we make sure that we're never on our own in a room with the door closed. Yeah. So it's those things as well. Yeah. Safeguarding then should sit within a whole raft of other things that a school has on the go. Okay. They're pastoral systems. Yeah. They're systems for noticing when someone stops handing their homework in, when someone misses certain lessons, or when they hang out with different kids, or they look like they're on their own a lot. So it's the noticing, and it's the awareness of what does it look like when a young person starts to slide? Yeah. Now, for example, when there's mental health issues, when perhaps a girl or a boy has an eating disorder, what do you notice? Have you noticed that she's looking really thin? Have you noticed that he goes to the loo a lot? Maybe he's being sick. Have you noticed that she, in the hot weather, is wearing really heavy long sleeves to cover up self-harm? And it's about that relationship. It's about having good relationships, but somehow structuring that within our pastoral policy, within our positive behaviour policy, or our trauma awareness policy, that says we take each child on their own merit, and we look after each child as an individual, each young person, and we notice these things. We know that we're in an area where there's lots and lots of expectation around lots of our children to perform really well academically. Does that mean that they look really tired, they look really anxious, they look like they've been self-harming? What do we do about that?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. Just a little side one I'll add in. Yeah. Do you think that in the whole process, we've talked about, like, educating our students on, like, giving them case studies of what happens and whatnot. Do you think, like, the 1 hour of PSHE that is given per week compared to the plethora of academic activities and stress and expectation, do you think that the academic system at the moment is enabling students to develop emotionally and socially as people to kind of get this balance between, okay, being academic is important and doing well is important, but also there's the whole other side of, like, understanding yourself, knowing how to manage your feelings and emotions, and knowing how to have good relationships and social skills, and all of these things that we give 1 hour to compared to the 34 other hours.
The thing is, you would hope that a well-rounded young person has a supportive home life, a home life that provides all of the really basic things like nice warm bed that's dry, enough clothes, enough food, love, attention, care, interest. And therefore, if that's in place and you've got those really firm foundations and you're hedged about with love and care and interest, going to school and doing all those academic subjects, that's fine, because at home your parents are taking you to things and you're doing things with them, and they're teaching you values, and they are loving you and showing you the world. Now, for 2/3 of our children, maybe less, it's probably like that, more or less. But for those for whom it isn't like that, what can we add in then that will make up the difference? Yeah. Some people will say, well, you can't ever make up the difference. But for some you can. Yeah. And I guess no, that amount of PSHE isn't enough. But if you get on really well with Mrs. Smith, and you know you can always go and talk to her, and she's always there for you, and whenever you go and see her, she never goes, oh, I'm sorry, I haven't got time. Yeah. She always says, just a minute, I can give you 2 minutes now or 20 minutes later. Yeah. always there. It's that. And I think if every young person in school has somebody like that, however well-rounded and great they seem, school will be full of value. School will be a place where it's actually great to go. And they know that if they do hit the rocks with their friends or anything, and they don't particularly want to share it at home, they can go to someone. So no, school can't plug all the gaps, but school can offer as much as it can.
It can offer that safe environment, I guess, where even if everything else is not going well, there's a culture and a space that they feel safe. And I guess it's that safety that's important. Okay, so I'm just going to go on to my last question.
Yeah, good.
And this is kind of a broad topic thinking, out of the box. Doesn't have to be like, you can do anything you want, click of a finger. And if you could make one change on any level, so it could be in schools, it could be a government policy, it could be just a magical £1 million, whatever you want. What would you change about the system we have now that would kind of combat ACEs and prevent the frequency of them happening on any level you so wish?
Yeah.
I know it's a hard question.
It is hard. ACEs generally go hand in hand with poverty.
Okay.
Worklessness. Poor housing. And is clustered in environments where lots of people are experiencing the same thing. So, wave a magic wand, everybody has a job.
Yes.
Everybody has a decent home to live in. Everybody has enough to eat, and they love their kids. So step down from that, and I would say if there's more that could be done when people are having children. So, for example, children's centres were great, but they've been axed or really, really pared down. Children's centres used to target those families. They used to have targets themselves for getting lots and lots of families registered. Health visitors. Back in the day, you had a baby, health visitor would come and see you, like for a couple of weeks, check up on you. They would pick up on mum seems to have been drinking, or dad's, I don't know, or the place is a bit messy or whatever. Now, I don't know what the health visitor situation is, but people have kids and nobody seems to see them, and it's kind of isolation unless they have friends, unless they have healthcare professionals coming in for another reason. I don't really know about that, to be perfectly honest, but the public health side of things, I think more early help would be amazing. And people feeling able, if they are stuck in those situations where they have an abusive partner, where do I go? Where do I go for help? How do I cry out for help? If someone's coming round already to see how you are, if they come to your home to do the 2-year check on the toddler, if they come to your home to do the 6-week check on the baby, they'll pick things up. They'll think, oh my gosh, this place hasn't been cleaned for ages. Or she looks like she's really struggling. Or mum feels more able to disclose to somebody one-to-one in her own home. It's quite intimidating going to a place to have your baby weighed when you're surrounded by people who you think are coping really well and you know you're not. So unfortunately, poverty, worklessness and poor housing.
It's interesting because I've thought a lot about those things, and I have 3 things I'll say on it. First, I think that from my reading that I've done on like happiness and how to be having a purpose in life, and knowing that there's, obviously I'm very lucky, I've been in a privileged position, I've had a good family, and so I've always felt like I've got a purpose and I'm going to do something and I'm going to be, but when you don't have that hope, you have a kind of hopelessness of I'm not worth anything, I'm not going to do anything, I'm not, my parents didn't, I can't, you kind of don't see the point, and it's hard to get past that. Second, I truly believe that most people would be really happy if they could. I don't think everyone wants to be like, I want to be a millionaire. But if people could think, I have the ability to earn enough just doing my whatever job it is, earn enough to support my family and not worry about food, you would take a lot of stress out of people's lives. And I don't think it's not a big change, but enough of a change that people aren't like going, I'm working like 60 hours a week and still struggling to pay for my rent and my food. And I think that's a disparity that I think if we could fix that, that would have...
For some.
It would help. It would make a difference. And I completely agree that the kind of the health check-ins on kids, just like having someone there it would make a massive difference.
One of the really interesting things that when you talk to social workers who've been in the job for a while will tell you that issues around ACEs and issues around children coming into the local authority care, into the care of the local authority, are generational.
Yeah.
And you think, well, if I could just do this, that would change. If I could do this, that would change. Actually, once the damage is done, that doesn't necessarily set your course for life, because there are lots of people that have been in care that are amazing. There are people in the public eye that have been in care, that are politicians. There are people that can have the most amazing life chances and grab a hold of them, and have amazing teachers in ordinary schools that give them that confidence boost to make them believe in themselves.
Yeah.
But conversely, there are families where, unfortunately, there are ACEs, there is domestic abuse, etc., etc. That affects the child. The child is badly behaved. They don't do well in school. They smoke. They hang out with the wrong people. They drink. And then, unfortunately, for lots of them, they get into trouble with the police. And then they may get a police record, and that's it.
Yeah, it's really hard to come
It's
back.
really, really hard. And you do, really sadly, I would hope it's lessening, but I don't know if it is. If it's happened to mum, it then happens to her, and then it happens to her child, and they have kids really, really early.
It's like generational cycle.
It's generational.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you think, well, what can we do? What can we do to stop that generational cycle?
Yeah.
Actually, it's my job with the team that I work in to say to school, are you putting your money in the right place for that child?
Okay.
If that child is 14 or 15, what are you doing to raise their aspirations for what they want to do later on? How are you making sure you're really keeping an eye on them? They're in the care of the local authority. They're the most disadvantaged in society. Who are they hanging out with at lunchtime and after school? Do you know that? Do you know they're not going to get into trouble? Does the social worker know that? Is everyone working together on that?
Yeah.
So there are structures and mechanisms in place
Which is awesome.
to try and stop that. It is awesome. Equally, some children have incredible, what you might call strokes of luck.
Yeah.
So, for example, there's a young person on my caseload who has won a scholarship to a boarding school.
Oh, wow.
It will utterly change his life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
So I've been reading a book about called Emotional Intelligence.
Who's it by?
Philip Pullman or something like that.
Right.
I can't remember exactly. It might be wrong. But it's literally talking about how like the emotional response of people. I've only got to like chapter 4 because it's quite heavy. But it talks about how the amygdala, that's our first contact point. So we process everything emotionally before it transmits through all the different neurons to our frontal cortex, frontal lobe, and that's how we do our like logical thinking and apply reason to what we see. But everything is done emotionally first, and so people who don't get that soothing that we talked about,
mirror neurons,
they don't get the skills like the impulse skills, and they always react emotionally before they can justify. In
a sense, it's more than emotionally. It's that sort of reaction is instinctive.
Yeah.
So when I train teachers about trauma and attachment, keeping it simple, we say that if you think your arm is the brainstem and your thumb is the limbic system, and then you close the brain over, and here at the front is your prefrontal cortex, and that's your thinking brain.
Yeah.
Now, for children that have experienced a lot of trauma, they tend to live more in their limbic brain and their brainstem, which is producing lots and lots of cortisol and adrenaline. And so if a child has had experienced a lot of domestic violence or sexual abuse, they have had a lot of onslaught onto their sensory, and they're often always in a state of high fear, so cortisol, and that comes out either as being violent or just really, really hyper. They flip their lid, and they literally can't think, so they're living here.
Yeah, I've read that.
Yeah. Imagine when you have dinged your car and you've crashed into a post, and someone says, "What's 9 times 7?" You just never know it, because you couldn't think, what's 9 times 7? Hang on a minute, I've just bashed into this car.
Yeah.
Your brain is flooded and your prefrontal cortex can't engage. Children who've experienced prolonged trauma can't engage their prefrontal cortex easily because they haven't learned the calming, the soothing.
Yeah.
And so what we have to do in school is bring in brainstem calming techniques for them.
Yeah.
Now some of the children on my caseload are the most extreme I've ever come across. And minute by minute, it's like this. It's almost as if they don't have any concentration at all.
Yeah.
And they have to have therapy and work done with them where they have rhythmic and repetitive and relational brainstem calming work. Things like bouncing a ball.
Yeah.
So if a child comes into school and they're really heightened, because coming into school really heightens them, if you say, right, what we're going to do now, we're going to bounce a ball. We're going to bounce a ball for 3 minutes. Boom, 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 boom. Rhythmic, calming, relational.
Wow.
What does that remind you of? Rhythmic, calming. Okay. They haven't had that. Yeah. That is not hardwired into them. So the more of that you can do. So we have lots of children who become adopted. Brilliant. But their responses are still as if they're in a situation of fear.
Yeah.
And so the bear's chasing them.
From what I understand, you can teach those skills. So you can teach, like, I think there was a word for it, but like the main like 7 skills of like impulse control, time management. You can eventually, even though they didn't get it, they're not lost. They're not lost skills.
No.
You can. It just takes.
The brain is very plastic.
Yeah.
Very plastic. Plastic throughout our whole lives. People used to think that the brain was plastic up to about the age of 25 or 30. That's not the case. Yeah. You can learn new things. You can. And if it's taught in the right way, or if you're going about it in the right way. And so for children who have really extreme trauma, so for example, dissociative disorder, where they become something else. And the reason for that is to exit their thinking and their conscious brain because something's going on with them which is so difficult for them to cope with that they can't be in the moment.
Yeah, wow.
So they become something else. Those children need to have a very, very specific sort of therapy, but they can be trained to get back into their body and into their thinking mind to be present. It's quite alarming when you see it.
Yeah, no, yeah, for sure. And I've done a bit of work with SEN just as being a TA.
Yeah.
And I've seen like hints and glimmers of that where a kid just becomes, and they'll change complete persona to be something else. Yeah,
that might not be because they've had trauma, but it's a way of coping.
The glimmer of coping. They can't deal with where they're at, the stress or whatever.
Yeah.
And so they just exit out of that situation into something, and then you're like, oh, okay. And then
I know. For some children, it's like putting on a funny voice, or becoming really stroppy. Yeah. And actually, if you know they haven't had trauma in their life and they're not a looked after child, and you know that it's kind of because they can't quite cope with the here and now, and it's all very threatening. You think, well, what can I do to bring that threat down? Yeah. What can I do that's soothing? You say, okay, well, let's just do some nice deep breathing here. You know, some square breathing, up, down, across, round, whatever. And our emotions and our bodies are very, very closely linked. There's a fantastic book called The Body Keeps the Score. Yeah. And we hold our anxiety in our body. And if you can train the body to release the anxiety, then the mind can become freer.
Yeah. Wow. It's so interesting.
It is.
The whole thing.
Really interesting.
But anyway, I think...
Is that enough?
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's good.
If you enjoyed the video, thank you. Subscribe, like, and I'll be bringing out another one soon.